Okay, so with that, let us begin this new series, The History of Islam. I'm very, very excited to talk about this. I've been wanting to do this for about a year now. After I took a class at Bayan in a master's program on the history of Islam. And I was very fortunate, and that's what we'll begin with, to have Professor Uwaymir, his name is Uwaymir, that's how it's spelled in English, Uwaymir Anjum, who is a professor of Islamic history in Toledo, the University of Toledo. It was a very pleasant class. I've been going to college since 2005. All right, you do the math. And I have taken probably over 100 courses throughout my academic career, and this is probably one of my favorites. It was very, very pleasant, and mashallah, he is extremely knowledgeable. And the way I set up this presentation, or this series, is actually following him. And he was generous enough to allow me to use his slides. So a lot of the slides, or some of them, are actually copy-paste from what he presented, or a variation of what he presented. And of course, I can't go into as much detail as he did, because he had a course for a year. Right? He goes from pre-Islamic history until the end of the Abbasid, the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, that long, and it's 2 classes, right? So obviously I can't fit that all in this series, because I planned for it to go until about the end of the year, maybe until the beginning of next year. So just to give him a shout out, Jazakallah khair for his work. He's been doing a lot of work. He's been getting these presentations ready for about 15 years now. So mashallah, a lot of work, and mashallah, he's a very knowledgeable person. So just to recognize him and to say Jazakallah khair for allowing us to learn from him. And
You're going to turn the lights off?
You want to turn the lights off? Can someone turn this one off, please? It's the third one from the right. Good? All right, so I just hope the camera's good as well. Can you check for me, please? So when we talk about Islamic history, this series will go over 7 units. And some units will be more than one lecture, right? And that is pre-Islamic history, or if you look at the title, from Jahiliyya to today. Right? So what's going on today is part of this session, and I think it's probably the more important part. So it starts off with prehistoric Islam, or pre-Islam, history before Islam, what we call Jahiliyya, and then we'll briefly go over the main points of the Prophet ﷺ's life. There's a lot of information about the Prophet ﷺ's life. There's no need to do it in a series like this, or if we want it, we can do it in a separate series, right, to give it its true due. But that will be today. And then after that, we will go into the Rashid era, the Khulafa al-Rashidin, which is from approximately 13 Hijrah to around 40 Hijrah. And then after that, we'll kind of briefly look over the Umayyad Empire, and then the Abbasid, and then the Ottoman, and then we'll look at colonialism, Islam during colonialism, and then Islam today, what's going on today, part of which will be Islam in America. This is a new topic that's getting a lot of attention. We're starting to realize that many of the slaves that were brought over from East Africa, or from West Africa, were actually Muslims. So they're trying to trace the lineage of Islam to America and how far back it goes. In fact, what we're finding is that Muslims participated in the American Revolution and whatnot against the British, etc. So it's important to have a brief understanding, or somewhat, foundational understanding of that, and we'll go over that inshallah. So when it comes to studying Islamic history, there are some challenges. Well, first and foremost, the Quran promotes the study of history. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا أَوْ آذَانٌ يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارُ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages us in many verses, one of which is this, to travel in the lands and take lessons from the previous nations. Right? لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. In their stories, the stories of the prophets, are lessons and morals. So history is a very important field of study, because through it we understand not only our origins, human nature, strategies, what worked, what didn't work, how how societies shift, etc. And in it are lessons and morals to understand. And another reason why it's very important to study Islam is because of Western distortions. And to give a little context to this, Talal Asad, who's heard of Talal Asad? Professor Talal Asad? Not a single person. Talal Asad is an anthropologist, right? His father is Muhammad Asad. Maybe you've heard of him. Muhammad Asad, the author of the translation of the Quran, right? He's his son. He is a professor of anthropology. And he has done marvelous work on trying to understand how religion kind of changed over time, right? And one of the ideas he presents in his book, Genealogies of Religion, is the concept that in order for a country or a civilization to be the dominant civilization, essentially they have to have control of ideology. And part of controlling ideology, or a result of having control of ideology, is that it changes the way we perceive history itself. Meaning the lens that we look at history becomes the lens of that civilization. What's important to that civilization becomes important in terms of history. Whereas in terms of the civilization of the actual history, it was something completely different, as we will see, and I'll give you examples of. So part of becoming the superpower is that you have to have hold of ideology. And this perhaps is why Fir'aun wouldn't let Musa go. Musa, والسلام, his message to Fir'aun was, there is this thing called Tawheed, believe in Allah. I'm not going to stay here and deal with you. Give me Bani Israel and we're out of here. You can keep your power, you can keep your throne. I'm not going to challenge you to that. None of the prophets challenged the political elites to their thrones or to their political positions, right? But Fir'aun wouldn't let him go. And perhaps the reason is that he recognized that if Musa was free, ideology would shift to his ideology. People would follow his ideology, and thus he would lose his authority, right? So when the West became the superpower or the civilization, what you find is that the way we perceive history has changed. And we suffer from that as being American Muslims or Muslims in America, right? We suffer from that. And I'll give you examples. So when you look at Western research and media, they inaccurately portray Islamic history, and that's because of two reasons. Number one, the agenda of Orientalists. We've all heard of Orientalists, right? They're a field of study that claims to be a research of the Eastern world. But a lot of times these people have agendas, they have ill intention, they're ill-intended, and they want to distort the image of Islam. Why? To dissuade people from becoming Muslims, right? And from that, they use this, what Professor Overmyer calls, facts and truths. So we have these things called facts. Today is October 2nd. That's a fact. We are the Orange County Islamic Foundation. That's a fact, right? And truths are something else. Truths tend to be derived from facts. But sometimes facts can be used to come up with, what's the opposite of truths? Falsehoods, right? I'll give you an example. The Prophet ﷺ married Aisha at a very young age. That is a fact, right? Now, the Orientalists will try to make a truth out of that, and that is the Prophet ﷺ was, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, a pedophile. So you have a fact, and they took the fact and made a falsehood out of it. So sometimes they will present things that happened in Islamic history, right? Especially when they talk about the Khulafa al-Rashidin, and especially the civil war that occurred, right? They'll present the facts. This is what happened. But they will derive out of it falsehoods. And inshallah, we will address these things. And a second problem of that is that the Western view of the world is predominantly secular, right? Meaning when they look at Islamic history, they look at it from a secular lens, meaning they differentiate between spirituality and worldly ambitions. So when they look at someone like Abu Bakr, radiallahu anh, they quote him as, just before he died, he said, "I wish I didn't take this position." Right? He said, "I wish I didn't become the Khalifa." Now, from a secular perspective, what does that mean? Right? What it means, or what they will perceive it to mean, is that he didn't do well. He didn't do a good job. He probably stole it, he probably did this and that, and there was some ambition to become the leader, etc. But when you look at it from an Islamic perspective, based on our understanding of who the Sahaba are, it has a completely different meaning. And that is, Abu Bakr now is thinking about his meeting with Allah. And he wishes he didn't have to be accounted for his political position. You see the difference? Why? Because, in the West, we're coming from a certain paradigm, certain perspective. And that tends to be, enforced or superimposed on history itself. So it's important that when we study history, we try and be as, dispassionate and unbiased as possible, so that we try and understand exactly what was going on, right? And this isn't to say that the Muslims didn't, fall short of that as well, as I'll get to inshallah when we talk about the challenges or the kind of the development of history as an Islamic science. And then finally, lack of resources and poor translations. There's not much information translated about what was going on, right? When you look at the major books of history, like the history of Ibn Kathir and the history of Ibn Athir and al-Dhahabi and these others, these works really haven't been translated, or only parts of them have been translated. So when people try researching Islamic history, they're very limited in what they can use. So they don't have the entire perspective. Also, in the West, they simply don't have this concept of isnad, chain of narrators. It's not part of Western epistemology. So when we talk about isnad, it's kind of like talking a foreign language. We don't know what this is. So they tend to deny it, right? So that these are challenges when it comes to studying Islamic history. And going back to this, imposing, what I was talking about, Talal Asad, imposing a certain paradigm on history, here are some examples. So you have above the realities of Europe during the Dark Ages, right? Some decisions were made before the court even sat, right? That's the reality. Now they take this and they universalize it, meaning if the Western world was doing this, that means everyone else was doing it as well. And then you have this scene from Aladdin, right? If you remember this. This is when Jasmine, went out. They didn't know she was a princess, and she went out kind of as an average person, and she took some bread to give it to some poor people. So automatically, this guard comes and he has a sword out. He's ready to cut her hand off, right? Without any you see how that works? They take this and they impose it on Islam and Islamic history. You have this, another thing from Aladdin. I like using Aladdin. I like using Disney a lot, right? This is Aladdin, right? The cartoon. This is the palace of the Sultan. And look at the detail. Like, this isn't random. Look at the bottom. You have these homes that are pretty much dirt. And the people are starving. That's the image of, right, Iraq. I think this was Iraq. They were talking about Iraq, right? Because this is if I remember correctly, this is meant to represent the Abbasid dynasty and their wealth, their palaces, and all that. It was a very wealthy time, right? But they say, look, the people were poor and whatnot. When in reality, this is an image of what? Western Europe during the Middle Ages. This is a church. And look at the homes. There are other images. Look at the size of these cathedrals during the Middle Ages. And when we talk about the Dark Ages, it was so bad. It was so bad that literally there are poems of mothers telling their infants to just die. That was their reality, right? And then you have these churches that were mega billion-dollar churches. And they're massive, absolutely massive, right? So they take this and they impose it on Islam. So it's very important to get these things out. When in reality, this is the Umayyad Masjid al-Umawi in Damascus. This is one of the oldest masajid that was built in the year 60 Hijrah, right? So you're talking about over almost 1,400 years ago by the Umayyad dynasty. This was built. So this is one of the oldest masajid on earth. And look at the size of it. Look at the homes next to it. The roofs of the homes are almost the size of the masjid itself, the height of the walls. Very humble. And this is Masjid al-Husayni. This also was built during the time of Umar radiallahu anh. So whoever been to Jordan, they've seen this. It's a very humble building, right? It's not this massive thing. And you'll see the Masjid al-Nabawi, etc. So there are falsehoods that are superimposed on our history. And our youth are growing up seeing this. They think that this is what Islam was. And when in reality, it wasn't. When it comes to the development of Islamic history, in reality, history didn't become a formal science until around 700 Hijrah. Right? So 700 years after the Prophet's death. Now we do have earlier accounts of history books like Tarikh al-Tabari, right? But it was kind of like an independent type of book. It wasn't a widespread thing. When did it start becoming popular? During this time, around 700. Why? Because this was the time of the Mongols. And the Mongols, which we'll talk about, was such a tough era, right? You find that there's literally a shift in Islamic society, right? And part of that was to preserve Islamic history. Because some people thought that the Mongols were Ya'juj and Ma'juj. This was the reality. From how powerful and how destructive they were, right? So they wanted to preserve this. And also what you find in the same time, eschatology becomes a very important science as well. The signs of the day of judgment and whatnot. So the scholars are trying to rectify these misunderstandings. Like, no, they're not Yajuj and Majuj, but this is the reality. So the Mongols, that event was so dramatic that it really shifted Islamic society. And after you find a change, right? And subhanAllah, it's almost as if that change allowed the Ottomans to come and become who they were. And when you look at the books of history, this is also somewhat of a challenge. And that is when someone reads a book of history, if they have access to the Arabic language and they read these books, what you find is that it's kind of confusing, right? The way they present information is not like a textbook that we study in school, right? It's kind of like they're taking all this information, putting it in one spot, right? So their style was making an encyclopedia of history. Their approach wasn't necessarily to bring unfiltered material, right? Or filtered material, I'm sorry, to present the most authentic narrations. Rather, their goal was, at least at that time, their goal was to gather all the information that have some sort of chain, right? And put it in one spot. Now you have this encyclopedia of Islamic history. Now you as a student or as a reader, you're responsible for deciphering between that which is authentic and not authentic, right? So this is what Professor Uwaymir says, that recently, it's only been until recent times that Muslims are starting to focus on filtering the material. And this is very important, because when we get to the issue of the civil war between Muawiyah and Ali radiallahu anhuma, you find that the information that we have on what was happening is very limited. Very limited. And this reminds me of another point Dr. Uwaymir says, and that's storytelling, right? A lot of times what you have is you have some facts, you have some details, but it's very limited. It does not give you the story of what happened. So there are massive gaps in what's going on. And what the historian needs to do, or someone, in order to produce a book that's readable, right, you have to kind of fill in those gaps. And it becomes storytelling. And to give you a funny example, a silly example, dinosaurs, right? How much do we know about dinosaurs? Not very much, right? But it's become like a massive industry that brings in millions, if not billions of dollars, right? Jurassic Park. And you have this idea of what dinosaurs or who dinosaurs were. The T-Rex is the strong dinosaur and stuff like that. They're trying to find out that T-Rex, the closest cousin to a T-Rex is actually a chicken, right? But what's going on? They have some facts. We have these things called fossils, and they form these creatures that no longer exist, but we really don't know what their personalities were, what they used to do, and they kind of just make stories out of it, right? So that's what happens sometimes. The method of Muslim historians was not fully developed, right? There's plenty of unfiltered material, and they were very loose when it comes to chain of narrators. Right? It wasn't like hadith where they were very precise, very keen on making sure that every narrator was worthy of listening to. Whereas when it comes to history, it's like, so long as there's a decent chain, it's acceptable, it's okay, we will go ahead and put it in our books as well. Something that has no chain of narrators, they wouldn't put it in their books unless it's to pinpoint that this is a falsehood. Be careful, right? Sometimes you have these understandings or these false misinterpretations that are spread throughout society, and then scholars need to kind of address that, so they put it and say, this is a falsehood, this isn't a true narration, etc. So I have some personal criticisms when it comes to the presentation of Islam in modern times. And some of them are, number one, the excess focus on individual heroism. When you think about history in Islam and presentation about the history of Islam, they tend to focus on individuals and their heroism. And there's nothing wrong with that in of itself. However, let's be honest, if you were to listen to the story of Salah ad-Din 1,000 times, it's not going to make you Salah ad-Din, right? Because Salah ad-Din didn't become who he was just because he heard stories of other people. He became something else because he developed his iman, right? And this tends to keep the focus on we're waiting for an individual to come and rise, right? And that individual, like Osama bin Laden, came and rose, and that wasn't exactly good, right? So this is a personal criticism. I'm not saying it's wrong to talk about these individuals, right? But if we're going to talk about these individuals, it needs to be at a deeper, more enhanced, engageable level. What made Salah ad-Din who he was? Right? He wasn't magically born like that. And sometimes they focus, his mother saw a dream that there was a sword in her stomach, right? So, if you didn't see a dream that your child was a sword in your stomach, then he's done. It's not the way it works, right? So, excess focus. Focus on the individual. Try to understand how he became who he was. How did he build his iman? How did the companions become the companions? It wasn't just overnight or just out of nothing, right? Attempts to portray Islamic history in a manner that agrees with and conforms to modernity. This is another problem, right? So you focus. The focus starts becoming on what's culturally acceptable. And look, the scientific miracles of the Quran. You have these things called scientific miracles in the Quran, and it's over exaggerated. I'm not saying there aren't scientific miracles in the Quran. What I'm saying is that it's exaggerated. The point of the Quran is not to be a scientific book. It is a book with a message and ideology. That's what changed society, not the fact that there were some miracles here and there. In fact, most people don't believe in miracles. Or if they were to see a miracle, they'd kind of just overlook it. And this is what the Quran says, right? So we need to understand Islam as it was, the Islamic history as it was. Number 3, there's a lot of limited information on the social and political realities of the Muslim world. We tend to have this image, right, that politically Islam was always messed up, when that wasn't the case. In fact, most Muslim rulers were decent people. And it's very interesting, if we talk about the Crusades, there was an individual who was an opponent to Nuruddin Zenki. So Nuruddin Zenki was going around for several decades trying to unite the ummah, right? And there were some individuals who didn't want that. They wanted to be independent, autonomous. So this individual, Muslim ruler, was conspiring with some of the crusaders in Jerusalem against Nuruddin. And it's described that this leader, who's corrupt and a traitor, right, would pray 5 times a day and would criticize the Christians and how they treated minorities. Look at that. Today, we're looking for a leader who treats Muslims okay, right? But it was just a different portrayal than what we are accustomed to. And there's a lack of presenting alternative modes of life and politics, right? Why don't we focus on how the system was working? It worked pretty well for them. The Ottoman Empire was 600 years. That's pretty long in comparison to other empires, right? The Umayyad Empire was very effective in its politics. The Abbasid Empire was very effective in some of its politics, right? Why don't we observe that? So when I talk about these eras, I'm going to focus more on information that we can use and benefit in our daily lives today, or in our understanding of the world today, inshallah. With that, we get into pre-Islamic Arabia, what's called Jahiliyya. And again, I'm going to briefly look over this just to kind of give us a mental image in our mind, that which can make our engagement with the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and understanding the Quran just a little bit more enhanced. So when you look at Arabia, you see this. I'm kind of just going to move around here. Over here is Mecca and Medina, right? These areas, this kind of smooth brown, all the way up here in Nufud, all the way down here is desert land. These are areas that aren't accessible by people, right? So when you look, you find that there are 2 entrances, that's it, to this region. And that is right here and from the north, right? That's it. So the Arabian society was very much isolated by natural terrain. And why is this important to know? Is because the following. We should ask the question, why Arabia? Meaning, of all the places Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have presented the last and final messenger, sent the last and final message to humanity, why Arabia, right? It's not because Arabs are better. And there are very little Arabs in this crowd. So it's not because Arabs are better. But I have a few opinions. These are just my opinions, right? I'm trying to understand and derive the wisdoms. Number 1, the Arabic language, of course. The Arabic language allowed the Quran to be what it is. Number 2, Arabia was never colonized. Till this day, this part of the world was never colonized. And this is so important because when a people are colonized, it creates a lot of ideological division. And then it becomes very hard to present something new, right? And this is what Muslims in the Muslim world are suffering from today. The post-colonial or colonialism kind of ripped the Muslim apart. It presented a mode of life that really changed Muslims and how they understand the world and how they understand Islam itself. So it is a wound that is continuing to bleed until this day. A colonized mind as well. So Muslims in America growing up, going to Western institutions are also suffering from this without even knowing, right? So as Fala Asas quotes, he quotes pretty much saying that the Western world has become so advanced and so creative in how they present the world to the point where they are the ones defining words. And now we need to deal with the challenges the Western world creates using the words they created, right? So it's to say in a different way, we are in their court playing by their rules, although we want to independently apply our religion, which is independent from Western history, right? It's very difficult. And a lot of times what you find, the more you study, the more you realize and starting to pinpoint how much we are affected by this. And I'll give you one example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls shirk the greatest injustice. Now, to a Western mind or someone who was born and raised in the West, this just completely goes over, right? What does that mean? How can shirk be an injustice? How does that work? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Why is that? Because when you define the word justice, what do you find? Injustice and justice has to do primarily, if not exclusively, to socio-political realities or issues. Can a person do an injustice to themselves? No, from the Western definition. Can a person do an injustice to themselves? No. Not really, no. Right? So euthanasia is a debated idea. Euthanasia is the idea that someone willingly commits suicide or medically commits suicide through a professional or whatever, right? It's being debated. Whereas in Islam, that's an injustice. There are theological injustices. Can someone do injustice to a theology or to God based on the Western idea? Not really, right? So when you look at these terms, freedom, happiness in Western culture is what? Excitement, joy, right? To give an example, if you ask your child the next time they wake up, as soon as they wake up, hey child, are you happy? It's going to be a strange question. Well, I haven't done anything to be happy, right? But if they go to Six Flags or Universal or Disney or whatever, ask them, are you happy? I'm jumping up in joy with happiness, right? Because the definition of happiness is joy, excitement. Whereas in Islam, you find the definition of sa'ada, happiness, is actually contentment. And what's interesting, define the word, or look up happiness in the dictionary and look at the synonyms. You'll find that contentment is actually synonymous to happiness. But it's changed, right? And this is very interesting. So it's important to understand Islam or Islamic history from an unbiased and uncolonized mind. Number 3, the emphasis on ethics and character, right? The Arabian world was very much focused on character and ethics. That doesn't mean they were angels. They did some very lewd and unethical things. But there was this concern for ethics and manners because they needed it in order to survive. Without manners, without forgiveness and forbearance that these Arabs embodied, right, they would have wiped each other out, right? Or at least they would have died because they wouldn't help each other. This doesn't mean other civilizations weren't equally as ethical or moral, right? But the Arabs had an emphasis on that. And when you look at faith and iman, whoever doesn't have good character, they're not going to have good iman or healthy iman. But whoever has healthy characteristics and manners, you'll find that iman enters their heart easily. And finally, it was an unattractive terrain which allows religion to flourish rather than tourism and business, right? So when you look at Saudi Arabia today, and we take a trip out to Saudi Arabia, if anyone tells you, I'm going to Saudi Arabia, what do you automatically think they're going for? Hajj or Umrah, that's it, right? Now, there could be some political whatever, business, whatever. But mainly it's Hajj and Umrah. Why? Because there's nothing else there, right? There's nothing, it's not a tourist attraction. Therefore, when we go to Saudi Arabia, we're going just for the sake of Allah. And that's why the trip is so amazing. Why? Because of the sincerity. SubhanAllah. So that terrain allowed that to flourish. When you look at the society, politics, and religion of Arabia, religion-wise, Arabia was, you can say, an adulterated understanding of Abrahamic faith, Abrahamic monotheism. So there were many elements of Abrahamic monotheism remaining there, such as Hajj, right, and Umrah, and circumambulating around the Kaaba. These were elements and remainders of Ibrahim ﷺ's religion. The concept of sacrificing, it goes back to that, but it was adulterated by polytheism and paganism. So most pagans, or most people of Quraysh, became pagans. And the story goes that polytheism, it was introduced to Arabia by an individual called Amr ibn Luhay. Right? Due to their businesses to Asham, to Damascus, they would go and they would be introduced to other civilizations. Right? That time, during the pagan Roman time. So this individual was there doing business, and he found someone selling these statues, these idols. So he asked him, "What is that for?" He said, "This is for rain. If you need it to rain, we go to this individual or this statue, and if you need, some provisions, you go to this statue." It's like, you know what? We could use some of that. And he bought two and took them back. And he is the one who introduced paganism after Ibrahim ﷺ's monotheism. But not all of Quraysh were pagans. There was a remainder of true Hanifiyya, Hanifism. And they were among the margins of intellectuals. And this is a very important point. Religion comes with intelligence. And by intelligence, I don't mean I just understand everything with my brain. I'm talking about actual knowledge, scholarship. Because a scholar follows ideas, facts, truths, etc. Whereas someone who does not have that knowledge tends to follow culture. And the Quran points to this. And if you were to tell them, right, come to what Allah and His Messenger have sent, they'll say, enough for us is what we found our parents doing, right? This isn't really an ideological answer. It's more like saying, this is our culture, this is it, well, I'm good with it, right? So intelligence is very important. And an example of that is Zayd ibn Nawfal, right? Who was the father of Sa'id ibn Zayd, who was one of the 10 who was promised paradise, right? Zayd ibn Nawfal, it said that he was actually alive during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, but before he became a prophet. And he was asked, the Prophet ﷺ was asked about him, what his situation will be in the next life, and the Prophet ﷺ said that he will be resurrected as a ummah in of himself, because he still embodied tawheed and monotheism before the message of the Prophet ﷺ. When it comes to society, they were a very tribalistic society, right? But there's a lot of misconceptions on understanding that, which I'll get to in a moment. Part of tribalism was that there was no central government. This doesn't mean there wasn't a sort of government, but there wasn't a central government. Rather, the way tribes worked was the following. A tribe is all of the same, family. It goes back to a grandfather or a father or whatever. This becomes a tribe. And there is a leader of each and every tribe. And the way they would choose leaders was not based on the European style of the eldest son. That's not how it worked. In fact, through all of Islamic history, this is very rare to find, which is another misconception. Right? Rather, they would choose the person who was most competent for that position. It was not based on lineage. It was based on competency. And competency was seen through, characteristics like forbearance, patience, generosity, etc. Why? Because such characteristics will be beneficial and suitable for the survival of the tribe itself, right? When it comes to lifestyle and economy, they were nomads. Nomads are like Bedouins. And there were oases, such as Medina was an oasis. Mecca was a business hub, if you will. There were trade routes, as I'll show you, and there were some cultivated areas. When it comes to art, poetry was extremely important. And this is probably another thing I should have put when it comes to why Arabia. Poetry preserves language, right? If you want to understand the meaning of a word, you go back to the poetry of the Arabic poetry, especially pre-Islamic poetry. And this is very important in our times today because some definitions of words are being challenged, like the concept of hijab, right? What does hijab mean? They try and change the meaning. Well, how do we know what it means? Well, let's go back to Arabic poetry and see how it was used, right? And this isn't something exclusive to Muslim history. Rather, anthropologists do the same thing. When they want to try and understand terms and concepts and shifts in society, they look at how words, the definitions of words were shifted, right? For example, the word faith. Pre-modern times, pre-enlightenment, faith was exclusively theological or religious based, right? So when someone says, I have faith, what it means is, I believe in God or whatever, right? But today, I could go to someone and say, I have faith in you. That's linguistically accurate, right? What meaning that I believe in you, yourself. And it's secular, it has no theological understanding to that. So poetry was preserved. Arabic poetry was preserved, which allowed the language of Arabs to be preserved as well. So if you want to understand the Quran and understand the definitions or the words used by the Quran, we look back at poetry to see how it was used. So it's very important. War was something that occurred. The Arabs would choose names that were very aggressive, vicious, like thunder and lion and tiger, etc. Why? Because when they faced their enemies, they wanted to strike fear in their enemies. As for their servants and whatever, they give them really soft and beautiful names like roses and whatnot. Why? Because when they call their name out, it feels nicer, right? That was part of their culture. When it comes to law, there was no formal system of law. Rather, there were customs. Arabian society was not large enough to really need a formal system of law, right? A code of law. Rather, customs were enough. Because if someone does something dumb, no one's going to marry them, no one's going to hire them, no one's going to do business with them. And that's just the reality and how things worked back then. So if you look at the political situation, it's not really clear here. It is. So you have two colors here. You have on the right the Sasanian Empire, which is the Persian Empire. This was a superpower. And on the left, if you can see that teal light blue color, Anatolia and Alexandria, Egypt, that was a Byzantine Empire, right? These were the two superpowers of the time. What we could say, America and Russia back then, right? That's how it was. And what you find is that, so the Sasanian Empire was, you can see Iraq as part of it, and the Byzantine Empire, Syria, Damascus was part of it. These areas had Arabs in them. And they kind of served as proxy wars. So if if the Persians and the Romans, were getting lazy, they didn't want to fight each other, they would send the Arabs to do the fighting for them, right? What's called today proxy wars. That would happen, right? And then they would give them payment and whatnot. So there were Arabs up there, but the Arabian Peninsula was pretty much, unoccupied. Down to the south, Yemen, that was sometimes occupied, colonized and whatnot, but at that time it was a very multicultural, diverse land. So there were Christians, Jews, pagans in that area. These are the trade routes. So the purple lines are the trade routes. And this shows you that although they were secluded, they weren't completely isolated. Meaning there was interaction with the outside world. So there was some sort of civilization that they had. And this is important because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن قَبْلِكَ إِلَّا رِجَالًا نُوحِي إِلَيْهِم مِّنْ أَهْلِ الْقُرَى. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He sent messengers, He sent messengers who are men and who are part of cities or somewhat developed areas. Allah didn't send prophets from Bedouins or people who are completely isolated. Why? Because there needs to be some sort of civilization in order to engage and to address these issues. Okay? So this kind of shows you what was going on. There were connections to India, to the Persian Empire, to Rome, to the Abyssinian Empire, which is to the left, what's present-day Ethiopia and Somalia. Common misconceptions about prehistoric or pre-Islamic Arabia. The Arabs before Islam were immoral. Right? They were doing lewd things. They were doing that's not true. Some things were happening. Right? There were brothels. There were some forms of fornication and alcohol. There was that, but it wasn't as widespread as people think. Right? These weren't drunkards going around and doing dumb things. There were immoral acts, but they weren't completely immoral. They used to worship many gods as equals, did not believe in Allah. This is also a common misconception. That's not true. Every nation, as far as we know, up until modern times, worshipped Allah. By Allah, I mean the Creator. Meaning they perceived that there was a supreme God. But the problem was they worshipped gods with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not that they were equal to Allah by their claim, but rather they were servants of Allah who were worthy of being worshipped. So the Quraysh would say, I forgot the Arabic, pretty much their talbiyah for Hajj. When now we say, labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka labbaik, illa sharikan huwa lak, tamlikuhu wa ma malak. Right, this is what they would say. We answer your call, you have no associates, except associates who you own and they don't own. right? So they worshipped them as well. They believed in Allah, they believed in existence, they used to revere Him and worship Him. An Arab at that time would never take a false oath by Allah's name because they were afraid of Him. Not like today, where Wallah bro and the Wallah bro culture. They were especially violent because of that. They had no stay or marker. That's not true, right? There are a lot of misconceptions, even among Arabs today, right? There's this thing called the 40-year war between two tribes. It's portrayed that they literally slaughtered each other to the point where the valleys were spilled with blood, right? They were flowing with blood. It's not true. There were some skirmishes. Some people died, but that's it. In the end, they'll go back to each other, reconcile, and hug each other, and they become friends again. Right? That's how they were. They never had a king or a monarchy. I guess that's not true. They were irreligious. That's not true. They were very religious, right? But they followed an adulterated form of tawheed and religiosity. They all buried their daughters. Women had no rights whatsoever. Again, these are also misconceptions. Umar radiallahu anh did not bury his daughter. This is a false narration. That never happened. It was only a tribe, one tribe that used to do this, right? And they are a tribe who fell into war with another tribe, and the other tribe overpowered them once and took their women. And this was the custom. They would take their women, but they wouldn't do anything to those women. They wouldn't force them to get married. They wouldn't, assault them sexually. Rather, they would wait for the reconciliation. The other tribe would come and ask for them back and whatnot. So they did that, the standard procedure, but one of these women, the daughter of the sheikh of the tribe, right, that was defeated, refused. She liked the guy she was with, right? She said, I want to stay here. And this kind of created this shame for that tribe. So they would bury the daughters every now and then, right, out of shame. That's what it's referring to. Quraysh wasn't every left and right burying their daughters. That's not true. Another reason why they would bury their children, not their daughters specifically, was because out of fear of poverty. That's not exclusive to girls, right? Women had no rights whatsoever. No doubt they were oppressed in many areas, but they still had some rights. And they still had an authority in society. And that's another misconception. Women had absolutely no right. They had no voice throughout Islamic history. That's not the case, right? But back then, authority and having a voice and influence was not through WhatsApp and, Instagram and these things, right? Back then, the Khalifa, the most known name in the Muslim world, can walk around the Muslim world and people won't even know who he is. They don't know who he was. Why? Because they don't have Facebook and all these things, right? So they don't know. So influence back then was not being popular. It was by something that you did. So take Fatima from Morocco, who built the first university in history, the University of Al-Qurawiyin, right? I mean, she built something amazing. How much influence did she present to the Muslim world? Well, how many people know about that? How many people knew her in her time? Not many. Now take someone like Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali wasn't really known during his time. Now everyone knows Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Bukhari, how many people prayed his janazah? Very few, a handful. But now he's Imam al-Bukhari, right? We all know. Back then things were different. It wasn't about popularity. Influence was not about popularity. So when you look at Arabic poetry and you see the role of women, right? They had their leverage over men, trust me, right? Because poetry always talks about women and like Umru al-Qais, he talks about a girl he liked and how she would kind of utilize him and sway him and whatnot. And he enjoyed that. So they had their influence, and there were female poets, like Al-Khansa. Poetry was very influential. It's like the CNN and the Fox of today, right? That was poetry. So women had just as much a role there. They were all nomadic tribes. That's not true. The Medina was a city. Mecca was a city as well. So to briefly go over the Prophet ﷺ's life, where we get information about the Prophet ﷺ, there are four forms. The Quran is obviously the first. When you look at the Quran, you can get a general understanding of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Especially during the Medinan era. So you have verses that talk about the Battle of Badr, and you have verses that talk about Uhud. So Badr was the second year, the Hijrah, before that. Then Badr was the second year of Hijrah, Uhud the third year. You have verses that talk about Al-Khandaq, which was the fifth year, and Khaybar the sixth year or seventh year, and Tabuk the ninth year, and I'm going over it. So you have the information, what was going on and how they were developing. Hadith is probably the main source which we take it because it's more in detail about the life of the Prophet ﷺ. What we call isnad. So that's where it goes back to. You have compilations of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, which is normally wasn't called seerah. It was called, it was called Siyar wal Maghazi, the battles and the great events of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And then what's called the local practice or Amal of Medina. So this refers to Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, who was a native to Medina and always lived in Medina. He was viewing and observing that the children of the companions and how they were implementing Islam and whatnot, and what they were saying about what they heard from their parents and whatnot. So understanding the life of the Prophet ﷺ goes back to the actions of the people of Medina, because they were pretty much implementing what the Prophet ﷺ was doing. So these are four sources. When it comes to the message of the Prophet ﷺ, we always think that this is, we all know this, what the message of the Prophet ﷺ is, but to be quite honest, when you look at the focus that you find today in khutbahs or in Muslim work or organizations, you rarely find this. And that is, the Prophet ﷺ's message was tawheed, calling people to Allah. We don't have many institutions or organizations that really focus on calling people to Allah. Doesn't mean they're bad organizations. Doesn't mean they're bad Muslims, right? But we need to appreciate the message itself. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Hajj, هَذَانِ خَصْمَانِ اخْتَصَمُوا فِي رَبِّهِمْ. When you look at the dispute between Quraysh and the believers, you find some misconceptions there as well. To the point where some people interpret that struggle or that dispute to be a political one. Meaning the Prophet ﷺ fought Quraysh because he wanted political authority. That's not the case. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says these are two adversaries who disputed over their Lord. Quraysh, led by Abu Jahl, were saying we worship Allah and we worship other than Allah. The Prophet ﷺ and the companions were saying, no, we worship Allah, there's nothing worthy of worship except Him. That's what they fought over. That. The Prophet ﷺ could care less about the throne. Right? In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said, if your people, talking to Mecca when he was immigrating, if your people didn't kick me out, I would never have left. Right? Which shows you, the Prophet ﷺ did not care about the throne or becoming the political power. He did become that by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that wasn't the main message. The message of the Quran, the first revelations, talks about the human origins. So we look at the first verses revealed in the Quran, Surah Alaq, اقرأ بسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم. It's talking about the origins of humans. And that is coming from who? Allah. And the last verse of the Quran is what? وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. And be conscious of the day you will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Quran starts with our origins, which link back to Allah, and ends with our final abode, which goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is about Allah. That is the message of the Prophet ﷺ. He called people to Allah. قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ. Say, this is my path, I call to Allah. عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي. With knowledge and insight, me and those who follow me. This is what it means to be a Muslim, and this is the message of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, his concern was to build relationships between the individual and Allah. That is his main concern. This doesn't mean he ignored social issues. He addressed social issues, but he addressed it at a theological level and not just a political or social or cultural level. Common misconceptions, the Prophet ﷺ sought political power. I just mentioned that and I spoke about that. The Prophet ﷺ died without designating a successor. This is an interesting question. The Prophet ﷺ is about to die, and he cares about the affairs of his ummah. Yet, he doesn't do something as critical as assign or designate or tell them how to choose the next leader. He leaves that completely out. And there are some theories around that. The one I personally choose is that this is actually a sign that he is a messenger. Right? Why? Because he built a religious identity, not a political one. It shows you that he didn't come to build a dynasty. Right? He came to build Iman. Right? And we'll talk about more of that, inshallah, in the next session. The Prophet ﷺ is more than a human. Right? One time I was teaching Syrian refugees in Jordan, Quran, and I mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ was a human being. And one of the kids looked at me, he's like, he's just a human being? I was like, yeah, he's just a human being. Right? He's not more than that. He's not supernatural. And that's part of the wisdom. All prophets were human beings. Why? So that they feel what we feel. And we can relate to them. So the Prophet ﷺ became angry. Well, we know what anger is. And he tells us, or we see how he dealt with his anger. He felt joy, he felt sorry, he felt grief, etc. We feel that as well. So it creates this connection with the Prophet. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the last verse of Surah Al-Kahf, which we all know, قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشْرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ. Say, I'm a prophet, I'm a human being like you. It is revealed to me that your God is one God, meaning there's only one worthy of worship. So whoever is hopeful to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then do good deeds, righteous deeds, and do not associate in worship with anyone. Do not associate in worship anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ is still alive. Now, you hear this. The Prophet ﷺ is still alive, right? بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. They are alive with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Az-Zumar, إِنَّكَ مَيِّتٌ وَإِنَّهُمْ مَيِّتٌ. You are going to die, and they're going to die, right? أَفَإِن مِتَّ فَهُمُ الْخَالِدُونَ. If you die, are they going to live forever, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does acknowledge that the Prophet ﷺ is going to die. Is he dead? Yes. Okay, what about these verses that talk about the martyrs and they're still alive, right? Well, these are two different things. The Prophet ﷺ is dead in a biological sense. He is dead. He is with Allah. He is alive in the other realm. Does that make sense? This is how you reconcile between the two verses. The purpose of Islam and the role of the Prophet ﷺ was to establish social justice. I bring this to very modern times, right? You hear this now. The Prophet ﷺ was a feminist, right? If the Prophet ﷺ was here, he would be in these rallies. Are you sure? You think the Prophet ﷺ would go walk around with people wearing, short shorts and tank tops and whatnot? Honestly, it's not to say that these rallies are wrong or morally unjust, but we need to understand and be sensitive what we relate to the Prophet ﷺ. How do you know? We say the Prophet ﷺ called to justice, this is what he called to, and we support this and whatnot, without bringing the Prophet ﷺ there, right? There's no need to give him these titles, because if we're wrong in that, then that's a big problem, right? With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will be held accountable for that. So the Prophet ﷺ, his role, his purpose, the primary role of the Prophet was to establish social justice. I've heard this from a professor of Islamic studies, who you probably heard his name, and he helped author one of the biggest translations in the Quran. I kept writing in my essays that the purpose of Islam is theology, tawheed, etc. So one of the classes, he's like, someone keeps saying that the purpose of Islam is tawheed. It's not. It's social justice. That's not the case, right? Social justice is no doubt something that the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ addressed, but they addressed it at a theological level. It's important. And when you look at how they addressed it, it's always about Allah and going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how we address it. We believe in the rights of women and in the freedom of women. Yes. Why? Because Allah made them free. That's why. Right? So give it that theological element and it becomes much more effective, much more profound. This is a rendering of the Prophet ﷺ's home. Right here. So if you can see in the bottom part, that is the kind of the room, the bedroom, what we call today, and the upper part, that is kind of the guest area. That was it. So if you can imagine, the Prophet ﷺ once, Umar radiallahu anhu entered upon him, and the Prophet ﷺ got up from sleeping, and his back was indented with the leaves of palm trees, right? So you know how when you're sitting on something, it kind of leaves a mark, and then it goes away, right? So Umar radiallahu anhu started crying. He said the king of Persia and the king of Rome are sitting on beds of gold or whatever, and the Prophet of Allah is sleeping on this. So the Prophet ﷺ said, are you not pleased for them to have this life and us to have the next life? So he said, of course, Ya Rasulullah. This is a rendering of the Prophet ﷺ's masjid. You see how small it is? That's what it was. And that's what changed the world. Right there. That's it, with the Quran. Because that's where the Quran was recited. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about when he's praising the homes where people go to remember Allah and raise His name. That's it right there. The masjid. You don't need 1 million followers on Facebook in order to be someone influential. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. Right? But you don't need that. You can be influential, you can have an impact without being known. In fact, it's better to not be known, so that it's closer to sincerity. And this is a rendering of the Prophet ﷺ's minbar. This is how it was. Okay. So with that, I thought I had a picture of Medina. I guess I forgot to put it. Oh, I didn't. Okay. I actually had put a picture of Medina today, the Prophet's Mosque today, but I forgot to upload it on the drive. I saved it on my computer, but yeah. Okay, so with that concludes the first session, and we leave off at the time of the Rashidun, the rightly guided Khulafa. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our sessions, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and reward you for coming out at this time. Jazakumullah khair. If there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. There's about 4 minutes until Aisha. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. How long was the time of Amr bin Luhay and the Prophet ﷺ?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Do you have like an estimate? Maybe?
That's hard to estimate.
Okay.
It's hard to estimate. So Ibrahim ﷺ is estimated that he lived around 1300 BC, and then Musa around 1000 BC. I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to say. Yes.
What is the technically correct way for us to refer to the rising of Sayyidina Isa?
A term. I don't know of a term in the Arabic language. The Quran says, "Bal rafa'ahu Allahu ilayhi." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought him up to him. Yeah, caused him to ascend.
So as far as, like the reference to, that the Prophet has died and others have died, like that's the...
Okay, I understand where you're coming from. Do we believe Isa ﷺ is dead biologically? No. We believe he's still alive and that he is coming back towards the end of time. So we believe that. So just because that would be an exception in these verses. And these exceptions don't negate the general portrayal of the general idea. Answer your question? Any other questions? Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, we'll see you next week.